lot of the attention that's been focused on security in mobile is around the apps. Right? People are looking at if I download a malicious app or something that might make my phone vulnerable, what is it going to do, and it's going to steal my information and send to somebody. And I think that's an interesting concern. It's if you look at the analogy with history, if you look at what happened with the sort of Windows security vulnerabilities a decade or two ago, what you found was that most of the original sets of attacks that people really targeted were at the operating system itself. Why? Because that's the thing that everybody has, right? And so same thing with mobile. The operating systems that are the most widely deployed are probably the ones that are going to get most likely to be looked at from a security point of view, and hackers are going to be attacking them because they are so widely deployed. And if you look at the apps, well, unless an app gets a huge deployment, it's not likely to be the thing that people go after first. That's what history would tell us, I think. And as the operating system gets hardened, then people start to move into the lower-hanging fruit elsewhere. So I think that that's probably going to play out in the security space for mobile, but again, that's what history would say. So Android does have a security architecture and the way it's designed. We tend to focus mostly on defects within the code itself. If you look at Windows, for example, they have a lot of features around security, but the real problems that arise are in coding defects, right? They're mistakes that developers made while developing that software that resulted in a hole being opened up that kind of circumvented all the best efforts of the designers to make sure that wouldn't happen. So I think if you look at the mobile space and with Android kernel and other low-level software in Android, it's probably true that the security architecture is well-intentioned and is likely to be fairly solid. However, mistakes happen in the code, and when that happens, you can circumvent a lot of things potentially. So it's a risk that if there are software defects, that there will be a problem in that way. The other thing is that if you look at the larger supply chain for the software, it's not that all of it is developed by Google. It's really a huge ecosystem where there's lots of players importing software into this larger system. So an OEM would integrate software that's from Google, but also from other third-party sources, and also from open source. And if you look at Google, well, they get software from Linux, and there's lots of contributors to that. And so what we've seen is that there isn't really a consistent policy for what defects should be fixed and when. And so what happens is, when you find a defect, it's kind of left up to, in some cases, an individual developer to decide, are they going to fix it? When are they going to fix it? Is it going to show up in the next version or not? It's kind of up to them, and not really up to any other entity. There are differences, but I think if you look at some of the most common coding errors, especially in low-level system software, both overflows and inter-overflows and things like that are still kind of the things that still happen. It seems like they're very hard to stamp out in general. But if you look at higher levels of the system, there's a different architecture. Like in Android, for example, you have essentially a virtual machine and Java on top of that, right? And the security model for that is different. So yes, there are differences, but if you look again at the lower levels of the system, you kind of, everything starts to look the same again. System software that interacts very closely with hardware and has bare access to a lot of things, and if you can break into that, then a lot of things can happen. I think it's a really tough challenge, especially when you're talking about open source developers that have their own, essentially their own standards, right, for what they want to do when they want to do it. I think it has to start with the proprietary code being handled in a very systematic way and being analyzed and tested thoroughly and having a standard for that. But in order to get the open source developers on board with that, I think there needs to be some social changes, right? There needs to be a social mechanism for them to really value high quality and to see that as part of their contribution. And right now, I think it's still something that needs to be worked on. I'm not sure I have an answer for you as to that, but I know that, again, being from a vendor in the space, I believe that analyzing the code with tools is one part of that answer. But really, ultimately, it will require people to really change their thinking about what software should be delivered as high quality and with fewer security holes. Today, there really is no standard with regard to that. It's just, try to fix the problem after it happens. I think it's easy to write about. It's easy to imagine a threat scenario where you're choosing to download something, But again, I think one of the things is that apps are not necessarily what, if I were a hacker, I wouldn't necessarily go after those first, nor would I necessarily even try to build one that was going to take over your phone. Why? Because, you know, first you have to get everyone to download it, and so if you get millions of users to download your app, well, gee, you know, you can monetize that. Why produce a hack if you can make money off of the app itself being so popular, right? For example, and the other thing is, if your app is really popular, well, gee, you know, it's gonna get more scrutiny, right? People are gonna look at that more closely and what it does exactly, and so you kind of have this built-in feedback loop of, well, gee, you know, why would someone do that? And so I think that's the part that people are missing a little bit, is that, well, yes, it could theoretically happen, but you know, why? You know? At the same time, if you really are a hacker that want to take advantage of a lot of phones, and you know, the operating system's on every single one, you know, you don't have to get distributed, it's there, right? So, and all the other low-level software in there, so it's all there. So I think that the attack scenarios, and sort of looking at things from that point of view, you see that maybe that's not the most likely problem that we're going to be facing, but it is there, but it just doesn't seem like it's a #1 priority in my opinion. But I can say that from looking at the publicly published issues that have been resolved and security problems that have been resolved in these software systems, that a lot of the problems occur in open source components. So really, it's, you know, it's all out there for people to see. I mean, WebKit is a great example of this. It's used in virtually all the phones, right? It's used in Chrome. It's used in many places. And when there are vulnerabilities in that, I often wonder when Apple releases those, like, well, are those patched everywhere else? No, you know, everywhere else. And if not, well, suddenly the hackers have a perfect place to go, and you know, there's vulnerabilities sitting out there.
Right.
You know, and I honestly worry about that. I have no idea if those are being patched or who's fixing those things. And my guess is that nobody is. It's my guess.